Representatives, and I also serve on the Housing Authority.
Brooke Moore, I'm the Vice Chair of the Affordable Housing Trust, and as such serve as our representative, our other representative.
Eric Savetsky, Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Bank and the Land Bank's designated members committee.
Joe Grouse, I'm the FinCom representative on the committee.
Christy Ferrantella, and I'm the Select Board Rep for this committee.
Dan Bogren, I'm the Real Estate Specialist for the town of Nantucket, the Chair of the Community Preservation Committee, and I'm staff to this committee.
Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for serving. I'm just going to say a reminder for some of the folks that came in that there is a clipboard going around. If you would please make sure that you sign that if you have not done so already. So we thought what we would do, and this is really your meeting, so we can spend as much or as little time here today. This is primarily an organizational meeting to kind of kick things off. But we thought we might review a little bit of our current housing status on Nantucket, as well as a safe harbor management document that you have before you. And from there, we can then get into the election, but then the advisory committee goals and scope of work, somewhat as outlined in the discussion document that was circulated previously. So if that sounds good, I'm just going to kind of hit some high notes, and if people have questions and so forth, I think that may be the better route than me rambling on for too long. So I guess the first thing I'm going to point you to is, and you all saw this previously, is our recent certification from the state of our housing production plan. And certification is another way of saying safe harbor from the 40B requirements. And as part of that letter and certification, they included our updated subsidized housing list inventory. And you can see from that updated inventory, we are presently at 3.9% toward the state mandated 10% requirement. So 24 is a magic number in Nantucket. In our case, that is what we need to create in a year to get a year of safe harbor. So we need to create 24 units that would qualify for the subsidized housing inventory list to get 1 year of safe harbor. If we create 48 units in 1 year, we get 2 years of safe harbor. The max that you can accumulate is 2 years. So from there, I'm going to turn your attention to this map, which is slightly, it's a little out of date. There have been a couple of updated numbers, which we will get you a revised version of, but this more or less gives you a sense of the different income restricted units around the island. Now, what isn't shown here is individual properties. So the individual covenant home, for example, would not be depicted on the map. It's a little too personal in information, as you can understand, but there are 84 covenant homes presently on Nantucket. You can see from this illustration where the more the larger concentration of units are located and proposed to be located. And you can also see the range at which the units are restricted. Everything from 30% AMI in the case of the Housing Authority, Landmark House, up to 170% of AMI if we're looking at the Richmond Development ownership units. And just, I have a feeling this group already is completely up to speed, but maybe for the audience, that in order for things to qualify on the subsidized housing inventory list, if it is an ownership property, it must be restricted at 80% area median income or less. If it's a rental project, as long as 25% of the total units in that project are restricted at that same 80% level or less, 100% of the units will count on the list. So for example, Richmond has 3 components to its project. 2 ownership, which are called Sandpiper 1 and 2, and then a large rental project, which is called Meadows 2. Meadows 2 is planned to be comprised of 225 apartments across a series of buildings, 16 or 20 buildings. All 225 of those rental units will eventually count on our SHI list if they are built and occupied. Only 25% of them are income restricted at the 80% level. The rest are at market. We now, and I'm going to turn your attention to this sheet, which is the Safe Harbor management sheet. We now have just entered a period of safe harbor, which basically means if a 40B project were to be proposed to the ZBA for a comprehensive permit and the town didn't feel it fit in or what have you, the ZBA could deny the project because we are in a period of safe harbor. They don't have to deny a project. There can be a 40B project that is the community might very well welcome, but they have the right during the safe harbor period to deny a project. So we have just entered a 2-year period of safe harbor, which runs to June of 2021. There are things, I should point out, there are things that need to happen along the way to stay in that certification. Richmond needs to, for example, not only have, they have pulled the building permits for 40 units, they need to complete them and have COs within 18 months of pulling the building permit. So just the fact that we've been issued the certification, there are still things we need to do to maintain the certification. But ostensibly, we're in a period of safe harbor to the beginning of 2021. I think pretty much everyone on Nantucket would agree we want to stay in safe harbor on our way to meeting the state requirement of 10%. So in order to do that, we need to plan to create 24 units that would qualify for the SHI list that are receive their authorization, if you will, like when they first would be eligible to count in that first 6 months of 2021. So we have to create the units in the year in which we want to request certification. So our current certification, assuming everything happens the way that it's supposed to, would run until June 14th of 2021. I'm sorry, June 13th of 2021. Go ahead, Dave.
Just on that side, when will the new census numbers impact our?
Yes, so that 10% number, great question. That 10% number that mandates, that is mandated by the state, is derived from the number of year-round housing units we have following the decennial census. So in 2010, it was determined there are 4,896 year-round residences on Nantucket. And so from that number, rounded, is the 490. That number stays in place for a decade. The census, as you all know, takes place in 2020, but the results, if you will, that would affect that new setting of the bar on our 10% probably won't be issued by DHCD until sometime in 2021. They said it's more likely 2022, but it'll last for another 10 years at that point.
Sorry, just, we're so used to all these acronyms.
Yes,
Can you,
I'm sorry.
Department of Housing and Community Development.
Correct. Department of Housing and Community Development. Yeah, please stop me when I'm like giving too much alphabet soup. The Department of Housing and Community Development in the state is the entity which is the arbiter of what counts on the SHI list and what doesn't count. They are the arbiter of certification or not. They also do monitoring of certain levels of affordable units. They do. They can be the subsidizing agency in a 40B development. So they play a variety of different roles, but they are the ones to whom we go to for rulings on things we want to get onto our SHI list and certification. And I would say, I feel like we have a good relationship with them, and they are quite interested in what goes on down here. Yes.
There's a coincidence of numbers here. You mentioned that we need 24 units.
Yes.
And then you said we have to produce them. I assume we means Great Big Nantucket, not this committee.
Correct.
All right.
We
How
as
did
an
the
island.
24 units that you've assigned to this committee, how did you derive that number?
Well, I haven't necessarily assigned it to the committee, but that was the proponents of the, so this committee is here as a result of a citizen article, as you know, at town meeting, which proposed putting $20 million behind the creation of affordable housing, and the part of their intent was to create 24 units in a year, so that the idea of this should buy us a year of safe harbor when we need it. So I think, I mean, I can't speak for the proponents of the article, but I don't think I'm going too far afield by saying, the article partly was born out of reaction to Surfside Crossing. And, we want to have greater control over how, we recognize there's an issue, we want to have greater control over how we as a community address it, rather than the state approving something that may not fit in with other priorities and goals and so forth and aesthetics of the town.
I'm hopeful that this committee is part of a mosaic rather than the pressure relief valve
Right.
for inaction by others. The way you stated it, it's almost, I don't want to feel we have the response. Somebody's going to say, hey, you're on. And we got to do 24 units.
No, you don't have the, so if we go to, that's a good segue into the chart. So if we look at the chart, you can see that it's largely Richmond that has provided us this current 2 years of safe harbor. Even though Richmond is ultimately can contribute really almost half of what we need toward our 10%, ultimately, the most we're going to get out of Richmond is 2 years of safe harbor. And that's just based on the rules of how DHCD views permitting and other things. So they're largely providing this first 2 year window. So there are other things that can provide that next step. So depending on the timing of Tacoma Green as another example, which is the 64 unit apartment project, town sponsored plan for next door to where we're sitting. That has been held up by a neighbor appeal. But depending on the timing of when that appeal is ultimately resolved, if the judge has already ruled in favor of the town and the developer, that has since been appealed by the neighbors, we'll see what happens after this next go round. But when that lawsuit goes away, at some point, depending on that timing, it could be that Tacoma Green would be providing 2 years of safe harbor, depending on when that happens. If that timing is off, then, I mean, it still will ultimately count for our 10% if that all moves forward eventually, but the timing might not sync with our certification needs. So we then look at, well, what else could we be doing? So the old fire station site, the select board last year had asked the trust and myself, is that a site that would lend itself to housing? So we commissioned a study with a group that is well suited to study these sorts of things, based in Providence, Rhode Island, and they came up with the answer to what could you do here. And so that is in front of you. Actually, there is a copy of the presentation that was given to the select board by that group, Union Studio. And in there, we don't need to spend a lot of time going through it today, but we thought it was important for you to have it as reference. And in there, you'll see that under existing zoning and given height constraints and setback and parking and so forth, they determined that you could create 30 residential units within this location, as well as gain some office space, community meeting space, parking spaces, obviously, and there would be, there's a need to look at how ultimately you want to use some of these additional spaces that would be created. But the residential would all be on the upper levels, and you could have 24 more units right there. So that could be the next extension of our safe harbor period. So the responsibility isn't of this group to keep us in safe harbor, but I will say, I think part of the intention behind the citizens' proposal was that we are always in safe harbor. And I think this group in part does need to keep an eye on what are these other things that are happening or not happening, and this group may be in a position to help extend if there is some impediment to one of these other routes getting us where we need to be.
Can you explain this? I understand you can only get 2 years of safe harbor.
Yes.
If Richmond happens to do 80 units in the next 18 months, I know they won't, but.
Though they probably will,
When we
actually.
get to 2 years from now, do we get credit for the second 4 years?
No, you can't bank anything.
You can't bank
Yeah.
anything, or
Yeah.
look back.
Yeah.
There's a real strategy to the timing of this.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, are you the point person on that? Who's taking sort of responsibility for that?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
With your help.
Excited about that?
I want to clarify, with the help of every other organization on Nantucket that's working
Yeah.
on affordable housing. Habitat for Humanity is working on getting their units shy listed. Housing Nantucket is shy listing their units. The Affordable Housing Trust has independent efforts of our own to create housing that would be shy listed. So this group is part of a complex puzzle. The importance that Tucker's getting at is that we all be in communication around timing, so that stepwise we stay in safe harbor. We don't create too much in 1 year and leave a gap 2 years later.
But
So-
part of it, well, thank you. And part of the thing is so when I first got involved with this work with the town, safe harbor was part of. I mean, there's unquestionable need, right? But in addition, there's a desire around being in safe harbor for some of the reasons we've already talked about. Six Fairgrounds was really designed to do that, and potentially could have provided safe harbor with respect to Surfside Crossing as an example. But we got in our own way, and neighbor lawsuits took that off the table from being potential safe harbor. So we can strategize and plan as well as possible, but sometimes there are some things that can get in the way. So I think having a plan A and a plan B, and maybe even a C, isn't a bad idea.
So I'll use the word redundant. You talked about you can't bank things.
Yes.
Is that why there's a negative 23 of Surfside Crossing? Because that's
Yes.
redundant?
No,
It's-
this is saying, if you see Surfside Crossing shows 1 year, so what that illustrates is the nature of the rules of 40B is when a comprehensive permit is issued, it automatically counts on your SHI list out of the gate. So we get some benefit from the fact that a permit was issued to them. Now, if it's appealed by the developer or appealed by the neighbors or both, we still actually get the credit for a year. If a building permit isn't pulled within that first year, it drops off, and this is meant to illustrate we're going to get some credit and then it's going to drop off. Yeah.
Do we, I'm sorry. Doctor.
I'm sorry.
Just so I have it clear, we're talking safe harbor, but once you reach the 10% number,
Yes.
let's theoretically say
Yeah.
there's a new number in 2022,
Yep.
and in 2022 or 23 we exceed that number.
Yeah.
Are we good for 10 years?
If we are above 10%, yes, we're good. We're in safe harbor. You are done as far as the state is concerned.
Until the next census.
Until the next, yeah, and just,
So you wanna keep working on it?
No, I didn't say we stopped.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know
Sure.
about the pressure points and the time.
well, and for whatever it's worth, people ask me, well, what's going to happen like come 2020 and the next census? Like, isn't our number going to go up dramatically, whatever? My short answer is our number, if it swings by more than 25 units, I would be extremely, extremely surprised. And it's just as likely to go down as it is to go up because we've been losing year-round houses in, look down Fairgrounds Road. We've been losing year-round houses like to seasonal buyers. So Judy Barrett in the 2015 Workforce Housing Needs Assessment noted that we had lost 640 units at that point in time from year-round like to seasonal. So if you look at the number of net new building permits, I looked at a 5-year period last year that would have been 2012 to 2015. We basically issue 150 net new building permits a year. So even if you assume they're all year-round, which is so far from the case, it's laughable. You're talking about a very limited number of units. Sorry.
Tucker, this is Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. It would be helpful to have basically a map that shows how we get from the 3.9% to the 10% with the potential addition of trachoma and anything else that's out there on town-owned land or anything else that shows how we can get there from where we are to the 10%. Is that something that you could have prepared for us for next time?
Yeah, and it's really, so that's kind of buried in a sense in the Safe Harbor Management sheet. It shows how different projects could contribute, making some assumptions about timing and phasing and so forth. But yes, I can turn that into a map visual color coded that would be a representation of if everything went according to plan, here's how we would get there. He may or may not have it right in front of him. Yeah.
So if we just step back, I'm wondering when the Commonwealth looks at us, do they exclude completely the NHA housing on Bartlett Road? Do they exclude completely, which is more year-round, I assume, the hospital housing? Why don't we
It's
get
not
more
restricted.
into that?
Workforce housing doesn't count.
Has to
That-
be deed restricted.
It's not income restricted.
It's not deed restricted.
I see.
It's not deed restricted, and it has to be, the affordable units have to be filled by lottery.
Okay.
Do we have a sense of what the timing is on the litigation on Tacoma?
So the judge ruled across the board in favor of the town and the developer in March. It was appealed. The plaintiffs have filed their brief. The town and the developer will be filing their, their response brief in the next 4 weeks. And the court has kind of indicated that they're interested in expediting this. So once they receive the town and the developer brief, we'll know, like they may, it could take 8 months from there, or it could be they say, we have everything that we need already in these documents, and they could rule like 4 weeks later. So we don't know exactly.
And so, if legally that stuff is put to rest, would the town break ground on that project as soon as possible, or would they play the game?
Well, so in an ideal world, it gets resolved before, let's say by September 1st. And then this fall, there's actually a mini round of funding that could go, this project would be probably score very highly toward.
So there's a good chance that this will not help us in our next safe harbor.
It depends. If the lawsuit goes the normal course, it wouldn't get resolved. That this current appeal wouldn't get resolved until next spring, and then they can appeal to the Supreme Court, but it's unlikely. I mean, put it this way: I'm told it's unlikely the Supreme Court would actually take it up because the merits aren't there.
Isn't this the second appeal?
This is the second, yeah.
So Dave, just to clarify, Tacoma Green, the way it's formalized or way it was created, the point at which it would qualify for the subsidized housing inventory is the point at which it receives financing. So the timing of its SHI list, the SHI listing of those units, it has to fall into a cycle of financing. So normally that happens in the spring. Sometimes they add mini rounds at other times of the year, which they've added this year. So potentially, if everything gets resolved and they can apply for the financing in the mini round in the fall, and they're granted the financing, those units would be SHI listed at that point. If we miss that funding cycle in the fall and then they're eligible to apply in the spring, they would be SHI listed when they were issued the financing in the spring. If they miss that one, then it just keeps getting kicked down the road. So it's not that it gets there's the financing determines that one, and each type of development and the way they're structured determines when it qualifies.
But a worst case scenario, it would help backfill what might come off the SHI list on our 2 year.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yes. Yes.
And the financing is both state and federal and local and
in this case, state.
They're federal LIHTC, but the state awards them.
Mm-hmm.
And they have in their stack they have, I think, maybe 5 different sources of financing, but the tax credits are the big part of it. Yeah.
Question. This lawsuit,
Yep.
in my distant view, is a nuisance lawsuit.
Correct.
Because they had a chance to testify. The citizenry had multiple chances. This was done by the book and done in the right way. And yet they've really hurt the town by the suit. And I wonder, are they made to pay a cost? For example, does the court task them with paying all the court costs for all of these appeals and suits, which would be a disincentive to do this in the future?
Yeah, I don't think they're tasked with doing that, and I completely agree with you. But I think I'm not sure what the likelihood of getting monetary damages, if you will, from them might be in the face of it being viewed as a nuisance lawsuit. But I think what the court has signaled is they recognize that this is a nuisance suit, and that's why they've sort of indicated they're going to be expediting this. So we'll see. Like if it were, it was just decided in March, and if the court were to issue a consistent opinion on this appeal in, end of August, early September, that'd be a very quick resolution of an appeal. We talked briefly about town-owned property in regard to the old fire station site. The other item I'll just mention, this map illustrates the Fairgrounds Road map. This site that we're actually sitting at, where the police and fire station buildings are located, where the proposed Tacoma Green buildings are located as approved. And you can see along Tacoma Way, the 2 homes that Housing Nantucket has created that are actually both on the SHI list at the corner of Waite Drive, and then the 2 homes that Habitat has created. And Habitat has worked, I want to say, very hard to actually have their homes included on this SHI list. They technically aren't yet, but going forward will be, just with a slight modification to procedures and so forth. The HCD is just, you gotta meet the kind of the letter of how they do things, and Habitat has been very cooperative in making adjustments so that can happen going forward.
Will this be retroactive?
Though it can't be retro, but it can be forward.
In various materials that you've set out for reading, the upper limit, income limits were 150. You just mentioned 170. I think in the warrant article for the 20 million, it's 200.
Mm-hmm.
So we're dealing with a 200% upper limit for the funds that this committee would be.
For these funds, it's up to 200% AMI.
Which doesn't qualify for the SHI list.
Well,
unless it's rentals.
If it's rental, it would.
I just have a question sort of through Tucker, maybe to Christy, about whether or not there's a select board policy with the use of town-owned land for affordable housing projects that they count towards the SHI list.
That has been the preference.
I mean, that's really their policy right now, and that's kind of been a little bit of a conundrum, and so Habitat has been working hard to make those adjustments so that any town land that's used for projects going forward would qualify in the SHI list. Yeah.
How often is the AMI recalculated? Is that with the census?
Yearly.
Yearly.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
housing and urban development.
Right.
yeah. So 100% AMI on Nantucket today is
116, 400.
Yeah. Thank you.
For a family of.
Well, so the 100% AMI is not family size based. It's just a number. So that's the area median income is I think it's 116,400, give or take a few $100. Now, when HUD assesses a housing cost burden limits, they vary it by family size. So, one of the challenges is it's not a direct correlation from that number to an 80% unit, because then 80% will vary depending on the family size, what is allowed to be charged. So, yeah.
I apologize, but could you just clarify the percentage, anything over a certain AMI, if they're rental, right? If they're 200, it doesn't qualify unless it is accompanied by a percentage of other units.
25.
Right, and that was what Tucker had mentioned earlier. In any particular development, so whether there's 3 houses or 350 houses on a particular site defined by the state as a development, if 25% of the rental units are capped at 80% area median income, then all of the units may qualify for the SHI list, even if they're market rate. So that's what Tucker was saying about Richmond. 225 rental units, 25% of which are capped at 80%, but all 225 will count toward our ultimate goal of 10%.
So, getting back to this particular article and the $20 million, it wasn't the intent of the proposers to scatter these houses all over the place, so.
Correct.
You're gonna have situations where they're gonna be individual building, right? Maybe a building lot that has 2 structures on it, or possibly 3. So in terms of this 20% rule, presumably we're talking 80% units all the time, right?
No, if there are.
Is the whole thing a development?
No, we tried that and we got a no so far, but they're open to further conversation. No, but if we bought, so one of the things we've talked about with this idea is that if you buy a property that has a single family home on it, and by right zoning currently it qualifies for secondary and tertiary, and we add, either it exists or we add a secondary and a tertiary, only one of those units would have to be rented at 80% area median income, because that would be more than 25% of that development. 3 units, one third is greater than 25%. The other 2 could be rented at different price points, and all 3 would count toward the shy list. We were kind of hoping we could talk about neighborhood first as a whole, as you just mentioned, but so far the state isn't interested in allowing us to bundle them together on different locations. It's a property by property is their determination of a development.
So this is starting to feel like a good point at which to elect a chair and vice chair and get into the discussion of the scope of this work. So I've noted, in terms of information that would be useful to the group, that coming out of this previous discussion, the map that Doug Abbey suggested that shows the illustration of, you know, how we get there and what's contributing and what other town land could make that happen, which we will get to you. And as well, just that last conversation, we will get you the AMI limits and the different income levels broken down by household size, so you can sort of have a full picture of what those are. What other things would be helpful to you that you can think of right now anyway?
I'd like to have a better understanding of how the select board is interpreting, or the state interpreting, using this money for existing housing stock.
Right.
Does
So
that preclude the purchase of vacant land?
yes, so we had requested from both town council and bond council a determination on that. What latitude do you have? And they are still conferring a little bit with each other, and will be furnishing an opinion probably this week. But John Giorgio, who is our main town council, did call me earlier today, knowing we were meeting, and relayed that I think there is generally the viewpoint that there's a fair amount of latitude with these funds, that they could be, there does not need to be an existing structure on a piece of land in order to qualify under this program. But just sort of take that with it will to be confirmed from them.
Would that include affordability buy-down transactions? As being, I mean,
yeah, I don't want to get like too far in front of them furnishing their opinion, but so you're going to get an answer to it, but I don't know for sure.
The conservative assumption is we must use it to purchase real property.
Yes. Yeah.
We're hoping that they will.
Because the language of the article, and which you have in front of you, so you have both the certified result of the town meeting vote on the final language of Article 37. As well, you have the ballot measure and how it was worded on there, and the vote total is just noted. So in the language, it talks about acquisition of real property, but they will let us know about the affordability by now.
Couple of questions.
Yep.
Does the 20 million have to be spent in the current fiscal year?
No.
or-
No.
And the second question is, does all properties purchased using this money have to be by RFP? Is that the process that's going to be used to purchase them?
It's normally the,
It depends on that, that would be the usual process, but there is a process where if there is the ability to make a uniqueness determination with respect to an individual property, and the town's procurement officer is able to make that determination that it is unique, then it doesn't have to go forward with respect to an RFP.
The only thing I'd like to sort of get into the thinking, and I don't know if there's a way to get it into the thinking. So when you read about property purchases in the INCI by the foundation, the Conservation Foundation or the Land Bank, often you read that they got it at less than market price because of the people's desire to see Nantucket preserved.
Yeah, but that's because you get a tax benefit for doing it. You get a charitable benefit for making a donation to those organizations. That's not the same situation with respect to the town. The town doesn't have the ability to give you a tax break.
I think they.
yeah, we
do,
could,
actually,
yeah,
I think.
we do.
Any below market sale to
Yeah.
government would qualify.
Yeah.
So potentially, that would be possible.
Yes, we could work with someone on that aspect.
The same benefit, whether it's conservation, any municipal governmental purpose, you get that benefit. Okay.
And on the opposite end, we cannot pay more than appraised value. So there has to be an independent appraisal of property, and we cannot pay more than that. So if a seller were interested, we would have a maximum number for any particular piece of property.
Where does that come from?
Independent appraisal.
No, I mean,
Where's that rule come from?
Oh,
Depends on
that
the
is,
source of the fund.
that's,
Yeah.
For instance, funds that are sourced through the Community Preservation Committee can't be done for anything that it has to be for 100% of AMI, and it has to be, can't be higher than appraised value.
This is different.
municipal
This is
procurement.
different, yeah.
I think, I'm not sure we're limited in that way, but
Okay,
this
alright,
is, this is,
We're getting into the details.
yeah, we're getting
Yeah,
into
we
details,
are.
and also so this is the authorizations that were passed were authorizations to borrow money, like for a specific purpose. It's not an authorization to acquire any particular piece of property. Like that will have to get approved in a different way.
Isn't that part of our job? Deliverables?
To,
Well, define programs for use of the up to $20 million bonding authorization.
yeah,
Criteria for RFPs seeking property for acquisition.
yeah,
Criteria for evaluation of properties sought through the RFPs.
yeah,
Criteria for RFPs seeking development and or ongoing management of properties acquired. And demonstration of how the programs jibe or fit with Safe Harbor.
The vision that I participated with Tucker in that, and the group, the vision was that we would be creating a sense of what we wanted to have this group do, to help us define what it would look like at the end of 2 or 3 years when we spent the $20 million, right? What do we end up having at the end of the day? Do we end up having 3 or 4 parcels with multiple units on those, and then a number of separate parcels with respect to individual houses that can be expanded? Or are there other scenarios that make sense in terms of creating the sense of the idea behind this, in terms of having affordable housing that makes sense from an economic point of view, but also don't have it look as if we've created just one sector that has only affordable housing.
Are we required though to work under existing regulations? Like existing zoning?
I think
For
that's the idea
instance?
behind the
I think that's,
article.
yeah, I mean, that's for you guys to discuss about, that, I mean, that's a discussion point. I mean, I think that's sort of intent of the article was probably to look to work under existing zoning in
Yeah.
some way. But just so this, just to make clear, like this group doesn't have the legal ability, like, to acquire property. The trust is the legal entity that has the ability to act on the recommendations of this group with select board approval, because anything the trust does involving more than $100,000 requires select board approval.
When I talked about existing conditions, I mean not just zoning, existing market conditions. I mean, those are constraints that will guide this process, I would think.
Then I think that was the intent of the article.
Yeah.
That that the money would be used to buy at market, or as close to as the town could legally approach that, properties that would be converted to rental units.
But there's no sort of outer deadline on this. I know when Dave asked if it had to be done, obviously it couldn't happen in a year anyway, but.
No, it's an open authorization, I believe.
I mean,
I don't know.
2 to 3 years would be miraculous.
Yeah, that's
I
kind of-
defer to the
yeah.
finance committee.
In my personal view.
Well, that's time to change zoning, 2 to 3 years if we had to.
So,
Why don't we go into the next item, and that's the next item. Is like, so why don't you all elect a chair and vice chair who can then take you through the discussion we've been starting to get into here.
Should you ask for volunteers?
I'm very happy to entertain any volunteer, self-nominations, nominations of others. Yes, sir.
Nominate Doug Abbey,
Second.
As
chair.
Mr. Abbey?
Is he still there?
Well, I think that it would be good to have somebody that's there year round, just because I'll only be able to attend, a couple of meetings while I'm there.
Is that a no?
I've had my eye on Mr. Hoey myself.
I prefer not to be chair.
Could we have co-chairs? 1 year round, 1 seasonal?
Sounds like an excellent suggestion.
I would do that.
You would do that?
Would you do that?
Doug, will you do it?
Yes.
I make a nomination.
I'll second
that
that.
Peter. And Doug Abbey
Are there any
co-chairs.
other nominations before we vote here? All in favor of Peter Hoey as our year-round co-chair and Doug Abbey as the seasonal co-chair, please say aye.
Aye.
I don't think there are any room for no's there, so I turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Congratulations.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
I think he was speaking to you, Doug, when he said that.
So now you guys have to decide who's gonna speak.
I'm just looking for the agenda again.
So I think we really want to maybe turn to that discussion document that had been circulated, and you should have a copy in front of you that kind of gives the lay, let's say the lay of the land, but background and goals for the group.
Also, I mean, I just think that we really need to get that opinion from town council to give us some guidelines on what framework we're working in.
Yeah.
That's probably the most important thing at this point.
Yeah, and they apologize that it's not ready right now,
yeah,
but we'll have it shortly.
Chuck, a question for you. When you're asking town council, if we have town land, could you marry some of these funds with town land to provide some of the subsidy to create units?
I'll clarify that with them.
Because I think what we're trying to do is create units, and that may be the most efficient way to do so. And those subsidies may or may not be available, but this could be a way of having something something happen which might not otherwise happen. So I think that's, I think some of the best places that meet the criteria that are in the little memo that you put out are on town land.
Yep. I would definitely inquire about that.
A quick question on, I think, under the deliverables, it says criteria for RFPs. So in the intent is that or at least at this point, the intent is there will be an RFP that the town would issue saying, in effect, we're interested in buying properties with these particular criteria, with these, maybe this range of prices or whatever. And that potential sellers will sort of submit their properties, as opposed to looking at their real estate listings and saying, gee, there's 6 houses out there or 2 houses or whatever. So the hope is that we will actually encourage sales by an RFP process.
Mr. Chairman, can I offer some clarification to this document since I helped write it?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Brooke Moore, Doug. So as we went through the process of sort of developing the concept for this group and, creating this sort of outline document, a lot of the questions that we considered were things like, what was the intent of the original article? What did the voters see the intent of that article when they voted for it? Cost effectiveness of unit creation. Buying individual houses for $1 million each is not the most cost effective way to do it, but when that's juxtaposed against the concept of not locating all affordable housing in one area of Nantucket, having it scattered around Nantucket. And so the cost benefit analysis of the different ways that we could utilize this money and the different, what a development per se would look like, whether it was 3 houses here and 3 houses there, or something a little bit larger scale, a few of those with some scattered site. So I think that's really what the purpose of this committee is to look broadly at the possibilities and then figure out the costs and benefits, the pluses and minuses of each option of how to spend the money, and then present a proposal to the Affordable Housing Trust and the Select Board with rationale for the decisions that have, or the recommendations that have been made. It's better to do this because we can do it for $50,000 a unit subsidy versus $800,000 a unit subsidy. I mean, that is the range we're talking about. So, the use of town-owned land versus going out and acquiring existing homes. So I think that's, in an overarching umbrella way, that's how I see the work of this committee. It comes down to a lot of nuts and bolts, including creating, once we decide what we want to do, whether it's one direction or two, then crafting RFPs for the acquisition. Is it open land or is it an existing house? Is it an existing house that already has a secondary unit? Is it an existing house that has primary, secondary, tertiary? How do we prioritize them? So when offers come in from sellers in response to the RFP, we have sort of a ranking system by which the trust can choose one property over the other, because to my mind, the transparency of the process to the community whose money we're spending and to the people who will be wanting to sell their properties to us is clear and available. They know what it is that's the criteria for which we're making a decision. And we have already had phone calls of people who've offered property, and we've had to say, hold on, we don't know what we're doing yet. So there is definitely interest out there, both from the sense of people wanting to sell their properties, obviously, and also people who are interested in solving the affordable housing crisis. So that's good news. And I think, but to my mind, we're here to craft a system that everybody knows what it is and how it works. So when we make decisions, they're justifiable and they have good rationale behind them. So I hope that helps.
Just the last thing, sorry, the last thing I just wanted to point out in front of you is this spreadsheet that it's two-sided with kind of assumptions on the back and then sort of a spreadsheet on the front. This was the document that the proponents had going into town meeting. This was used in discussions with the finance committee as it did its work, but this was an illustration of, you know, kind of the literal, you know, going out, finding properties, improving them, and having, you know, widely scattered site locations to get to 24 units. So you can see at the bottom of the horizontal spreadsheet, Tobias Glidden, who was the proponent of the article, had found 11 properties that sold last year. You know, so you know, some assumptions need to be built in about increased inflation, et cetera. But in any event, he found actual properties, 11 locations with 18 existing units on them in various states of repair, and sort of was trying to illustrate, had these funds been available, here is how the program might have looked in one form, and how we would get to 24 units. And then you can see assumptions on the back about both the improvement of those units as well as the ongoing, you know, maintenance and operation, if you will, of those properties. So that this is somewhat relevant as sort of what was in front of people going into town meeting. And as you can see, the average cost per dwelling unit, as the numbers here were articulated, is approximately, you know, a $690,000 subsidy per unit.
Where's that number?
That's, so if you look on the assumption page, top right-hand side,
Oh, yeah.
cost per dwelling unit.
The warrant article actually doesn't limit us to rental, right? I'm assuming we prefer that the houses that we build or buy will be rental, but it doesn't limit us, right?
We get a way bigger bang for the buck with rental.
With rental, yeah.
And is there the assumption that there would be somebody managing these properties and, yeah?
That's a good question.
The other factor that you need to take into consideration, if you're buying a property that is currently utilized by a year-round person, that person has to leave because you have to replace. It has to be a new person going in that goes in by lottery. So that's a factor with respect to the criteria in terms of the priorities. So if you're buying a property with a seasonal resident, that is a more desirable situation than buying a property where you already have a year-round resident.
Who's renting?
The rental is still a lottery situation.
Yes.
And is that only for the 80% AMI, or is that for the higher percentage AMIs as well?
And
yeah, how do you handle it?
Yeah, we just, and because we're from Housing Nantucket, we just filled our 18 Tacoma Way units. So those are 2 shy listed units. There's 2 units on the property. One of them was awarded by lottery, that's the 80% unit. The other one's the market rate unit. So we just took somebody from our ready to rent list and put them in there. So we did not have to have a lottery for that market rate unit.
How long is your ready to rent list?
It's very, very long. You know, I don't have it exactly. I can see actually. I do have.
And is it
Ballpark.
hundreds?
It's hundreds of
Yeah,
people.
it's hundreds. It's the need.
No shortage.
No.
No, you know, 226 qualified households earning between 50 and 100% AMI right now on our ready to rent list. We have them categorized by 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, can you say that again? What was that?
There's 226 qualified households earning between 50 and 100% AMI on the list right now.
Staggering.
Is that a requirement?
So they're earning between
If they earn more than 100,
We
they're
don't,
not on your list?
no, we don't take them for our regular.
So I'm gonna repeat that into the microphone for the public, that Housing Nantucket's ready to rent list has 226 households, families, that are qualified between 50 and 100% area median income that are looking for housing.
And to put the money to it, it's was it 58,000 a year to 116,000?
Yes, so 100% area median income household would be 116,000, Well, depending on their family size,
Say a
so.
four-person household, let's just say,
Yeah.
so 50% for a four-person household is 58,400,
Yeah.
and 100% is 116,800.
So 58,000 to 116,000. So that's the landscape, part of the landscape. And those are the ones we know about.
If I can ask another question. In terms of the other responsibilities of this group, it sounds like you'd like the committee to come up with kind of a vision for the kind of properties, what the rental sort of entity might look, or rather the assets might look like. Are we also responsible for coming up with how we select a rental agent? I mean, this is gonna be in effect public housing, and somebody's gotta take care of these buildings. They're, you know, whether we hire an agency to clean them and pick up the trash and fix things, or whether we hire people. So that's also sort of part of things we should discuss. It's sort of a more detailed question from that. In this particular model that Tobias did back in the town meeting, in the first year, there's $465,000 of operating costs. And my guess would be there is more costs if we have staff or we hire an agent to sort of take care of these properties. Is there authorization to spend that money? Or is the money that the 20 million only to acquire the asset?
20 million, so again, town council is, with bond council, is clarifying the allowable uses of the money. But I think I can say this already, that the monies can be used, are likely going to be able to use for the acquisition of property, for the improvement of property, not for the operation and maintenance of the property.
So where does the working capital come from?
The rental income.
On property number 1, on property number 2, you're gonna have upfront cost. I mean,
Right.
There's money that needs to be, so something the committee should think about. You're gonna need money to run this little business.
CPC.
Nope.
In addition, the stated rental income here is $754,000 in year 2, if you will. But is there an expectation of what percentage of an income this entity should charge for rent?
Well, so I think one thing that's going to inform your work is that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund had contracted with the Nantucket data platform for greater understanding and data around both the supply side and the demand side. And that report is due, I think it's September of this year. So that document may be very useful in guiding where you want to be recommending the units are directed toward. I can tell you in this spreadsheet, the assumptions were where there was a property with 1 unit, it has to be 80%. So the market rents were at 80% relative to the size of that unit, number of bedrooms in that unit. Where there was a second unit, the second unit was at 120% of AMI, and where there was a third unit, in this illustration it was at market, but market probably is no greater than 200% of AMI here. 120.
Something we might be a goal for this committee is if there are impediments with the existing article, there could be an amendment to the article proposed for the next town meeting, allowing us, if we all agree there's something that needs to be tweaked. So we should probably keep an eye on that and be ready for town meeting if necessary.
It's a great point.
Really good point.
So the bond issue would not occur until next spring?
Well, the bonding authorization exists as we sit here. So the bonding can, if the select board approves it, it can happen at any point, essentially.
One of the things, Peter, to keep in mind is that we have 2 years of safe harbor. So again, we go back to that beginning conversation of how do we time our work and the creation of units through this program to fit into the mosaic of safe harbor and unit creation, with that map toward 490 guiding us all the way through. That's always got to be in the back of our minds. And then the other piece is where we price these at, right? The reason Neighborhood First was focused on rentals was to allow that flexibility in price points of only 25% of each development being at 80% area median income, so we can address the housing need at multiple income levels through rental properties. And so also, again, keeping the mosaic of, you know, Richmond development is 80% and market. Tacoma Green is 50.
No, Tacoma Green is a handful of 30s, a grouping of 60s, and then the largest single group is at 120s. 40% of the development is 120s, and then 20% of it is at market.
So the idea would be that we would want to keep an eye on where the other affordable housing programs are pricing their units, and fill in the gaps based, hopefully, on the details that we're getting from the data platform.
Starting with property selection.
Property selection, and then pricing the rents and all of it. So it's a complicated puzzle to put together, which is why we have this.
The timing is really important too.
Yeah.
Because if Tacoma Green comes in play, and those building permits have to be pulled out in a reasonable period of time, you wouldn't want to spend this money to, in fact, do it in that time frame. So it might be that you're not spending this money until year 3 or year 4 from that here on out. So in terms of the thought process as to where you're thinking, which is why it was so important that we set up this group to have a general sense of understanding all of the things that interplay with each other, and create a sort of map that says that this is where it really fits best if everything works together.
But Brian Turbot, I mean, so he can definitely give you a better answer on your question there. And, you know, in terms of when they go to market twice a year for the town for bonding and so forth, but he more or less had indicated that they can make things happen in between, depending on the timing of ultimately how
I'm
things
more
happen.
concerned that they not go to market until we consider.
They're not going to borrow a cent, yeah.
It's a big debt service number.
Yeah.
And Eric said, I think we might want to consider modifying the warrant article in order to have the use of funds include administrative expenses, some modest amount until our rental flow can cover our expenses.
Sure.
I think that's reasonable. I realize we could go to CPC and others, but I'd rather have the control.
The CPC too, you have issues with the CPC. We can't fund for maintenance unless it's property that we funded through the acquisition we funded through the CPC. So we can't fund somebody else's problems. We can only fund property maintenance for properties where we gave you the original funding to be able to acquire the property.
I'd just like to say, in reading the Warren article, there's some fudge language in there, in that the money can be awarded to the Affordable Housing Trust.
Right.
And so we may not have to go with a warrant. We'll wait to see what the attorneys say.
Yeah.
Because there is language there that's not precisely defined and could provide that flexibility.
Maybe you could convey that it's a concern of this committee.
For sure. Yeah,
Issue an opinion.
the monies would be a grant from the town to the trust, and there likely would be conditions of the grant that would be consistent with the interpretation of the warrant and ballot articles by town council. And we will get it clarified.
This is Doug. Let me just make a comment, which I don't know who, I think intelligently pointed out that we should sort of have a range of alternatives that we should look to. Tucker, let me start off. One question is, who do we have, and if I were in the room, I might point to you, but how do we get from here to our next meeting to begin to fold together, and who, do we have you, or do we have some resource to help us think through and how we come up with a grid and a solution for, or a set of alternatives? What kind of resources do we have as a committee?
I mean, I'm happy to, I mean, you have me to help get you what you need.
I think that's the right, that's
Me as well.
That's what I wanted to hear, is that you will help us get to the next thing. But it seems to me that there are two thoughts. One is that I do think that we will look at this idea of the single family alternative that's been proposed and identify the costs and benefits of doing so. And then I think that's sort of one end of the spectrum, which is let's go out and buy $20 million houses. That's about 20 people. That's kind of one way you could do this. And I think we should as a committee, come back with a recommendation as to whether that's a good idea and what the costs are, and the issues that were raised about administration and what happens when the roof needs to be replaced. Do you have adequate replacement reserves for maintaining the house? But the other end of the spectrum, I think, is, if you had $20 million and where could we most strategically invest that $20 million to achieve the goals? I think the goals in the memo that you put out are the right ones, which is to get out of jail, to get out of 40B jail, and to produce units as efficiently as we can in large numbers of units, not just onesies and twosies. So, is there a way of thinking about if this $20 million we have the flexibility to spend it in a different direction, which was to create more dense housing, near transit, near public services? What would that look like? Are there actual properties that we could consider, or either on townland or otherwise, so that there's sort of the other end of the spectrum, the alternative, instead of buying onesies, what if that's plan A, what is plan B? And how could we spend that money, and what would the per unit cost potentially be of deploying those resources? And how many units could we produce, and at what cost? And how would that help fill the gap between the 3.9% today and the 10%? So I think that's the right thing for us to try to pull in that before our next meeting, to try to pull together sort of a discussion document, so that we can see if we can come to an agreement on it. But I think that seems to me to be the next step.
This is Howard Dickler. In addition to those two options that you've outlined, we've heard a third option raised by Joe, that we could use town land and use this money for affordability. A fourth possibility for the committee to consider, in my mind, is to use it to buy land if the town doesn't have enough land, because the toughest variable is always going to be land. There's multiple other sources for actually building the houses, federal, state, etc. So that should be an option that everybody thinks about as well.
So do we need to include plots of land that meet the sort of transportation and other infrastructure hub things as part of this map? Like, where are these parcels and who owns them?
I think it may not be about identifying particular parcels as much as identifying ideal criteria or prioritizing criteria in a way. And I want to gently remind us all that that I understood the impetus for this article to be a counter proposal to large-scale development. And I'm very cognizant of the cost, the balance of cost effectiveness against density, against location. And I think it is going to be critical that we discuss all of those factors in making the decision, and maybe in some way it's some hybrid choice where we're doing multiple different things. I think underlying all of this is an idea that the entire island share and I'm gonna say in quotation marks, the burden of affordable housing, that it not all be concentrated in one place was part of the impetus for this. So I wanna stay cognizant of that as we debate the merits of different routes. And there's nothing to say there's not a lot of middle ground. For instance, if we were to acquire a piece of property and propose a development that's less dense than is allowed by zoning, by doing a partnership through conservation land, a piece of it, or simply by spending more per unit to have a less dense development in any particular location. So I think there's a lot of different ways we can go. And I'd love to make sure that we talk about all of them and figure out what combination seems to work for this bucket of money.
Just as a, sorry, I'm looking at him, but I realize you're our chair. Just as a follow-up to that, some of the largest scale developments that this island has ever seen are still under construction. So I think we need to understand what that's going to be like for us, large and dense. So just that comment. Thank you.
Traffic, I mean, implications.
Well, I just, how does it feel to the community?
Yeah.
Is it achieving the goal? Is there a better way to do it?
Back to working with the Land Bank and the Conservation Foundation. Eric, could you, I think the Land Bank in 2016 or 2017 adopted a policy. I just briefly looked at it. Could you explain that to people?
So the policy.
Cooperation policy or whatever. Maybe.
Yeah, it's a sort of a non-compete that we assess properties we're looking at to make sure they're not ideal for affordable housing, so that we're not in competition with affordable housing. Make efforts to try to partnership on affordable housing where appropriate and where the opportunity exists. Although up until more recently, there really hasn't been the funds to for affordable housing to come into partnership. And also we run ads in the paper twice a year, trying to alert homeowners or landowners of interest in acquiring land in partnership for both open space and affordable housing. That ad just came out recently, and we got a phone call from a couple of 4.5 acre size property owner because of it. So, and immediately called Tucker and Ken and Ned about it. So, that's really the gist of the policy.
Okay, thanks. I had lunch with a couple
Eric,
of...
is there a way, or just a quick question, Eric, if you look at the inventory, and I think this was raised at our last meeting, is there land that's appropriate for development that's been in the hands of the Conservation Foundation or the Land Bank that might be a candidate for a land swap to take the better located land that may be less environmentally sensitive and swap it for some other land that could be acquired or is owned by the town that could be made a swap? Is that something that kind of inventory been taken to see if there's anything in your book or in the book of the 50% of the land that is in conservation that could be potentially eligible for what we're trying to do?
I really haven't done that sort of a look at that with regard to the Conservation Foundation's land, but in looking at land bank land and the town's various entities' interests in relocating our island home, we've taken a look at potential land bank land because they were interested in a particular parcel that wasn't going to work. And we've struggled to find any parcels that were really appropriate to dispose of to development interests. If they were acquired by the land bank, they were primarily acquired because they had some open space value. So there may exist one or two or three possibilities, but it's pretty slim. There's nothing that seems flat out appropriate to be swapped with the town for something else. So, but a closer look could be done there.
Doug, I had lunch a couple of weeks ago with two guys, at least one of whom was in the past on the Conservation Foundation board. And they mentioned to me that there were Beinecke properties donated to the Conservation Foundation. And they said the Conservation Foundation is looking to, pass those on or sell those. I'm wondering if that's a rare or unique example, or whether there are other examples like that, and maybe we could have a conversation with with the Conservation Foundation, specifically about the Beinecke properties. I know nothing more than that. I think they may have said they were in Tom Nevers, but I would have not thought they'd be in Tom Nevers.
Those would be like scattered small parcels
Yeah.
surrounded by other houses that were gifted to them and have no conservation value.
Yeah.
So, and I know a few of those parcels in Tom Nevers. So
Yeah.
they
So those
might be something to
might
pursue.
work for us. Maybe we could do a
On my
little,
list here.
okay, good. Thank you.
Tucker, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So when Surfside Crossing got their comprehensive permit, that automatically initiated safe harbor if it was over, or it immediately goes on the shy list. For Richmond, it was when they pulled the building permit. So with us, with this program, at what point, is it when we purchase a property or house? Is it once we have a renter in it? At what point would these houses be on?
Well, so when they go on depends on the method that you're using to have them go on. So presumably, well, so in the case of Housing Nantucket is a good example over on Tacoma Way. Those units are added through what's called the Local Action Unit or Local Initiative Program. Same way that the Habitat units will go on in the future. So those come on basically as of when that Local Action Unit application to DHCD is approved. And that is the method by which, if we were purchasing individual properties, more than likely that's the method by which they would go on to the list. So that does raise, like, if a goal was to create 24 units in a year, as stated by the proponents, it would require a tremendous amount of coordination to actually be acquiring and applying for 11 different properties and having those 11 different LAU applications all approved within a relatively finite period at the beginning of 2021 as an example, as opposed to something where you're going for either a comprehensive permit or a special permit like with Tacoma Green, where you've got greater numbers and fewer number of applications.
So if we were to purchase something or this program started, would we wait to submit that application until we had a significant number of units to put together? Or do we want them to be in the same unit?
Well, depending on what direction or directions the group ends up going, the short answer is yes. This needs to be highly coordinated to land the plane right when it needs to land to continue safe harbor. Yeah.
Put in a little thought.
Yep.
If you don't mind, we'll see you, Mr. Chair. I happen to have been employed by a law firm years ago before I worked in town, but there were, I know, many of these law firms represent entities that are, for instance, a group of alumni from universities who own undeveloped properties, and they've been holding on to them forever. I don't really know what, I guess there's some tax benefits that I have known of some in Tom Nevers that are buildable. They're either record lots or they're actually zoning appropriate buildable. It might be something, I don't know if this is a plausible idea, where you could approach the law firms and sort of the head lawyers in these firms, say, do you have entities, LLCs, trusts that are interested in conveying a or some portion? If somebody could go to open recreational purposes to the land bank or so forth, but it might be worth doing to approach the law firms because obviously they have their fingers on the pulse of what's out there that hasn't been developed. It's owned by these, I mean, I know of one case, I'm not going to name names, but it's, the entity is a group of alumni who've owned a piece of property that's worth a lot in Tom Nevers, for very, very, for, you know, about 45, 50 years. So, and they've done nothing with it. It's just a thought.
In taxes.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure that obviously it's a tax break, but there would be a tax break as well, perhaps if they sold, below market value or something. Just a thought.
I think we've done as much as we should today, and we should just, maybe you and Doug and I can get together and begin to work on a agenda for the next meeting.
That sounds terrific. So we do, we do have some members of the public here for sure. So we want to take a few public comments before we go.
Yeah.
As well, if folks could take a look at those future meetings, we wanted to just ensure that we had a space and dates available. You all are free to obviously change these, but we thought we'd start somewhere in terms of suggesting something. And so they're all on Monday. Generally, it's either the 3rd or the 4th Monday of the month.
And our charge is to deliver on or before February 15th, 2020?
That is the goal set by the Affordable Housing Trust.
Okay, thanks.
Nothing to prevent you from doing it sooner.
Thank you, Mr. Bogram, on behalf of the trust.
Does Monday work for everyone?
They're all good dates except for one.
Okay.
Okay, great. So would you like to take some public comment?
Yes, please.
You have to turn around.
So if anyone would like to comment on any aspect of what the Neighborhood First Advisory Committee is undertaking here, we'd simply ask if you would come to the microphone near David and Posey to make your comment to ensure that we record it properly. No public comment? Okay.
Freaking violent.
A lot to take in this first meeting, that's for sure.
The microphone may pick up my voice because I can boom it out. I think we ought to be, this community ought to be real proud of the, I'm Dick Berreby from Fisher's Landing, sorry. I think, speaking for my wife and myself, we're proud to be in the same room with you. I think you have really assembled a really impressive group. This island is in good hands in this regard. These issues are incredibly complex. We are well aware of that. And you're off to a real good start. I know it's going to take a little bit of time, but you're on your way. Good job, guys. Really impressed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if there are no public comments, I guess we need a motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor?
Aye. Can I have a motion to close the Affordable Housing Trust Fund meeting? All those in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Really exciting. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah.